You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Blind, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Stephanie Robold.
Authors. I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. The Feisty Heroine romance collection of short stories. Over 30 plus pulse racing shorts to capture your heart with USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and award-winning authors in the mix. Paranormal, contemporary, fantasy, and historical romance that will whet your appetite with titillating, heart-pounding tales you'll want to read again, then beg for more. Fall in love with your next book crush. Pre-order this amazing collection of shorts, over 30 pulse-pounding stories for only 99 cents.
Proceed with caution. Buying this collection may lead to addictive reading, falling in love with your next book crush, and staying up past your bedtime to see what happens next.
Get your limited edition copy of Feisty Heroines. Look for the link in the show notes of this episode. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Megan Kate Nelson on the show with me today. She has a phenomenal new book. It's called The Three-Cornered War, The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. I have to tell you, Megan, this I'm a history buff myself, and sometimes I enjoy a good dry history book, that you can kind of sink your teeth in and kind of slowly work your way through. And there are lots and lots of those books. And then there are the kind of history books that grab you because the narrative is so well done, and because we get to see a period of history through the eyes of a character that we care about, or as you've done, through the eyes of like 9 characters. I forget the exact number of 9 viewpoint characters. And it's just so amazing and so well done. So I'm super excited to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk about writing. In addition to all of the content about the significance of the war in the West, the history stuff. But it's fun to talk about the writing process too. For sure. Well, and that brings us to our first question. What is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller? I was thinking about this because I've listened to a couple of your other interviews, and so I knew this question was coming. And I'm not sure about when I first wanted to be a writer, I definitely have memories of when I first understood that I could use language to provoke a response in people, and that made me happy. That was a very pleasing sort of thing. And it was really when I was quite young. I was in, I think, second grade, and we were supposed to write just a little piece, some sort of little fiction piece. And I wrote something about my stuffed animals. I think I was probably inspired by the Velveteen Rabbit or something like that. And I wrote about one of my stuffed animals that got up in the night and got lost in my house. And apparently this story was so disturbing that my second grade teacher called my parents and said, Megan wrote this short story about the stuffed animal, and it was kind of upsetting. And so there were different moments like that, sometimes with fiction and sometimes with nonfiction. I remember vividly in high school writing an analysis of a poem, and there was a moment where I was like, oh, I can connect the structure of the poem to the meaning of the poem. And I thought to myself, oh, my teacher is going to really like this. Like, this is good. Like, this is good stuff. And it was those kinds of moments where I just knew that I wanted writing to be a part of my life, that I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the feeling of writing things out and then imagining the effect on a reader.
Well, for a kid to think in terms of connecting the structure with the meaning, that's pretty intense.
Yeah. And I think I've always thought about things that way. I was a voracious reader from when I was very young. My parents always took us to bookstores, and, it was a real treat. They sort of treated books like candy. Like, if you're good, we'll buy you a book. That was the bribery, so I was a very well-behaved child with a very large library. And so I loved losing myself in literature, and I loved writing. I think my first attempts really were fiction, but I never could really get the hang of it. I'm sure you've talked to many people, fiction writers, who feel that sort of, they feel compelled to write every day, and they feel these stories kind of welling up inside them and wanting to come out. And it was never like that for me, but I always knew, I think because I read so much, that I could develop my own voice and that I could write about different worlds or write about people's sort of frames of mind in the past or in the present in a way that would be compelling to someone reading it.
That's so from an early age, you knew that this was going to be a part of your life. There was no doubt and no separating that this was the path that you had been set on.
Right. And in fact, at one point I thought I wanted to be a teacher, a high school teacher. And so right after college, I did in fact get a job teaching in a private high school in Pennsylvania, Go George School. That's my old school. So I was actually an English teacher in the first phase of my teaching life and taught literature to freshmen and sophomores and juniors. And I left after 2 years to go to graduate school because I really missed writing. And in fact, it was when I first went home, I went home to visit my parents in Colorado and on one of my first vacations. And I was just exhausted because, as anyone who is a teacher knows, like, teaching is exhausting. And high school teachers are the heroes of this nation. And with everything that they have to deal with just on a daily basis. Oh, yeah. But
my oldest son is a middle school English teacher. And,
wow. Oh, God bless him.
Yeah. He's in the trenches for sure.
Yeah, that is the Lord's work because, but those kids, I sort of love talking to middle school students. They have such fertile minds. They're so creative. But when I went home, after sleeping for a couple days straight, I think, I woke up and I read a novel. I was reading a novel that I was thinking of teaching, and I wrote a paper on it. Just for no reason, just because I missed writing. I hadn't written anything in, many, many months. And I wasn't really feeding that side of myself as a high school teacher. And so that is actually why I applied to go to graduate school, which is an interesting plan. I think I could have done writing in another way without actually going to get my PhD. But that was really what compelled me, is that I missed the writing.
So what did you pursue your PhD in?
So my PhD is in American Studies, and that's an interdisciplinary program that you'll see in a lot of schools. A lot of liberal arts colleges have this as a major for undergraduates, and then there are a couple PhD programs that still exist now across the country, but it really emphasizes interdisciplinary work. So my dissertation and my dissertation committee included 2 English professors, 1 history professor, 1 American studies person, and 1 art historian. So I was working with all of those things. I was working with literature and with historical documents, with landscapes, with art, and then also ultimately with architecture. And that's really what characterizes American studies work, as opposed to more kind of straight up PhD programs in history or in English. So when I started, I knew that I wanted to do more history, though. That sort of ended up being my focus. And so what I bring to my research and my writing about history is that interdisciplinarity. So I use every single source that I can possibly find, whether it's a print material, whether it's poetry or fiction or journalism, diaries and manuscripts, and then also material culture and visual culture and the landscape itself. Those are major sources for me also when I'm trying to figure out what happened in the past and also what motivated people in the past to do what they did.
So as a person who is so geared to be a storyteller and is so wired for writing to the point that you write papers on novels that you read for fun just because. When you get into such an interdisciplinary academic setting like that, what does that do for the creative side of you when you're looking at architecture and all of the different expressions? Does that feed, like, how do you feel like, that experience and that part of your education has fed you as a storyteller?
Well, I think part of it was just pure exposure to different kinds of writing. So I was taking English classes, so I was reading a lot of novels and short stories. I was focusing on the 19th century, so I was getting a lot of my canonical and then also my kind of new types of pieces of literature. Did a lot of reading of Faulkner. At first, I was a Southernist initially before my turn to the West. And so I've read a lot of amazing Southern literature. And as you can imagine, given my first forays in writing, the Southern Gothic style really appealed to me. I love Faulkner. I love Flannery O'Connor. Some of Willa Cather's freaky short stories. I love those. So that all very much appealed to me. And actually, my dissertation was on swamps. And swamps are very Gothic landscapes. And so that was part of the appeal, is that I got to read a lot of swamp lit poetry about swamps, nature writing about swamps, which is fantastic. And when you do work in other fields too, you get to see how other kinds of scholars write as well. So I was reading a lot of scientific literature, scientific journalism, travel literature, and all of that. I really do believe that the more you read and the more widely you read, the better writer you become. And even though my dissertation, which turned into my first book, and then the second book I wrote, which is a Civil War book about destruction, those are more structured in the sort of dry style that you were referencing earlier. They're very argument driven and very thematically organized. I took great pride in the fact that I think those books are very clearly written. And I think that they have some really nice moments in them. But it was really this third book, The Three-Cornered War, that gave me the opportunity to really play around with creative style. Like, how can we tell history differently? How can we be inspired by literature or by film or TV to think about the ways that we tell the stories of the past? Because I think a lot of historians don't have that kind of instruction, and they don't think about things in that way. They are thinking about argument. They're thinking about making an original argument. They're not thinking, how can I tell this story to readers and really not only make them think differently about this moment and give them something to learn about, but also give them a really good read. Because those were my goals for this particular book. And I left academia 5 or 6 years ago now to write this book. And that, I think, really freed me to play around and be more creative. In graduate school, I was just remembering this the other day. I took a geography class, again, because I'm so interested in landscape and environmental history. And I wrote fiction for my final project because he allowed it. I wrote a final research project called 9 Stories, which was about the displacement of people in Denver to build the new baseball stadium for the Colorado Rockies, from 9 different viewpoints. So this actually could be the sort of origin point for my thinking about ways to really convey these very complex moments in our past.
That's so funny. This time period is something you're obviously very passionate about. What is it about the 19th century and then this little window, about 2/3 of the way through the 19th century when we're dealing with the Civil War? What is it about this time period that fascinates you so much?
I think I was first drawn to 19th century American history and literature. First of all, I think maybe through the literature, because the American Renaissance was such an important moment with the emergence of Emerson and Hawthorne and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass, all of these people writing all different kinds of literature. I think we forget that Hawthorne wrote short stories and that Poe wrote, maybe we don't forget that Poe wrote poetry, but he wrote, short stories and journalism and kind of longer novellas. And I really loved that period of a kind of American literary flowering. And the driving force of American studies, and then also when I was an undergraduate, I was a double major in history and literature of America. And so one of the driving questions is, when did people start thinking of themselves as Americans, and how did they define that? How did they really understand themselves as people living in this very specific political and social culture? And so that was part of it, so that here is a moment where writers are really coming into their own and really founding an American literature. So that was, I think, interesting to me. And then also, this is a moment in which so many pivotal things are happening that shape the nation today, really. I mean, we have the first imperialist war with the Mexican-American War that Americans engage in. And we have the really strengthening of enslavement and what that meant, not only for the South, but for the West and the North as well. And then the Civil War, right kind of in the middle of the century, that, just is this profound moment of breakage and then of a kind of crooked healing in the aftermath. So there were all of these developments that I think I was interested in as foundational American moments. And that's really what drew me. I think in every century, there are all kinds of interesting things to think about and write about in terms of the emergence of America. But for me, the 19th century was really the center of it all.
the West and how it the part that it played in the Civil War itself and in the cause of the Civil War even is not something we think very much about. Although the West was very much one of the contentions that was on the table that even caused the Civil War. The idea of how this new territory, this new unsettled territory, was going to play out in the political back and forth, and how it would be used, as a pawn of sorts by either side, is something that I think gets left out of the conversation a lot. What was it about this area, this unsettled area that drew your attention to it during this Civil this time? We all think about the battles in the East and all of this sort of stuff, but this is a really interesting area and a really interesting time that is just completely forgotten about in most modern discussions of the Civil War.
Oh, absolutely. Two things interested me. One, we do talk about the West all the time when we talk about the run up to the Civil War. The kind of coming of the Civil War is all about the West. It's about,
and then we stop talking about it.
It's like the guns fire on Fort Sumter, and suddenly the West doesn't matter anymore to anyone, anywhere. And I don't think that's true. I mean, most certainly, all Americans in the North and the South and the West were really focused on all of the events in the East, because the center of politics was in the East, right? And the massive armies of the North and the South were in the East. And also the majority of enslavement was in the East. And so when emancipation comes, that is primarily an Eastern development. So there is good reason that Civil War historians have focused so much on the East. But my argument in the book is that, the West continues to matter. It continues to be the focus for both the Union and the Confederacy. And I was really interested in why and how that happened. And then the indigenous peoples who lived there and their response to this conflict and the interactions they had with both the Union and Confederate Army. And so that was one thing. And then also, I'm from Colorado originally. And, I've lived most of my life in the East with some side trips to Texas and California. But most of the time I've been in the East Coast, but I grew up in Colorado. It is, my home state. It's very dear to me. All of my family still lives there. And so when I first started doing research, actually for the previous book, for Ruined Nation, and I was just doing generalized Civil War research, and I found out that there were these battles in New Mexico and that they involved Colorado soldiers, I was shocked, because I had never heard of that. I had never heard that the Civil War had come that far west. I had never heard that Colorado soldiers were involved. My history classes had not contained any of that information, and there was really no imprint on either the landscape or the historical landscape in Colorado that would indicate to me that territory had any part to play in the Civil War. And so that is one of the things that I like to think about, is how people erase certain events from popular memory. Like, how does that happen? What are the mechanisms that kind of create a commonly held history, and what is left out of that? So those were the two things that were driving it, sort of the sort of interest in why we have stopped talking about it. And then also my kind of personal roots and my personal connection to the West, and trying to figure out what role it played.
The title of the book, The Three-Cornered War, is a fairly provocative title. What do you mean by three-cornered war?
So that is a term that a California soldier actually used to describe the war in the Southwest. As he was marching with the California Column, which was an army of about 2,000 men that marched mostly on foot from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande, which is an incredibly long march of more than 800 miles. during the spring and summer, through the desert, through both the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan Desert, he described the conflict as a three-cornered war because he was explaining that they had a Confederate enemy and they had a Native enemy. And that in the West, this is what the Civil War meant, that it was the Union and the Confederacy and indigenous peoples. And so they were fighting the war on multiple fronts. So that is what he meant by it. It also has, for me, it has a couple other different valences. It actually has three others. So there are kind of three meanings to the three-cornered war. The Union, the Confederacy, and Native peoples. Also then the argument that the Civil War was about the North and the South, but also the West. So three regions. And also that it was fought by three racial and ethnic communities, Anglos, Hispanos, and indigenous groups, which is also something we don't think about very much. When we only think about the Eastern battlefields, the focus is really on white soldiers until the summer of 1863, and then on armies that increasingly had Black soldiers signing up in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation. But we don't think about these armies in the West where the Union Army has Anglo soldiers, it has Hispano soldiers and officers, and then it has Native scouts and spies. It was the most diverse army in the Civil War, and we never talk about them.
Right, right. One thing about history that is fascinating, and to see how history is accepted by kind of into popular culture, is the farther we get away from an event, the more it gets reduced to bullet points. And some of that is just because there's just too much information. Things are happening all the time. So we can't retain all of the details about every historical event because it would just, there's just no time or place for that. So inevitably things get reduced to, the farther you get away from it, it gets condensed until all the nuance is lost in something, and we just kind of get down to the nitty gritty. The Civil War has kind of gotten that way to a large extent, reduced to a conversation about slavery, and it absolutely was about slavery. I'm not diminishing that whatsoever. But the fallout of the Civil War had many more implications besides just settling the argument of slavery. And the Three-Cornered War is an outstanding example of all of the implications and how we're feeling those implications even today. In the way our nation, ultimately came out of that, and the West was, ultimately settled, and all of that. As an historian, how do you, deal with what the popular conceptions of an historical event versus, really getting in there and peeling back the layers, and how important is it for us to really get down to the nuance of what happened in the past?
Yeah.
And that's an extremely complicated question. I'm sorry, but I think you get what I'm trying to go.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, this is the problem. We do like to think of things in black and white, right? And so this is why the focus on the East has been so dominant, is because it's easy, right? It's North and South. It's black and white. It is brother against brother. And those kinds of things are, they're mnemonic. They're very easy to understand and remember. And they are very sticky, right? So they lodge themselves in your brain. And even, anyone you talk to, if I talk to anyone on a plane and I tell them I'm a Civil War historian, it's sort of like, they're like, oh, Gettysburg, Lincoln, there are certain things that you learn in high school that just get drilled into you and you remember forever. And there are good reasons for that. And these things are, in fact, extremely important. But I think, any historian worth their salt is much more interested in the nuance. And part of that is because we understand that history is complicated. And part of it is, quite frankly, that it's in the nuance where historians kind of make their mark, right? Like they're always trying to find new and different angles to talk about in the war. And I hear a lot like, oh, haven't so many books been written that were really just sort of all talked out about the Civil War? And that's not true at all. I mean, there are so many experiences that people had on the ground, Americans had on the ground, that we still don't know enough about and that we would benefit from learning. And so one of the things I wanted to do, and part of the reason that I wrote the book with the structure that I did and the way that I did, is that pretty quickly I understood in my research that this was a very complicated theater of the war. It involved multiple communities speaking multiple languages. It involved all with their own kind of community histories. It involved actions taking place across hundreds and thousands of miles, which, and this area, I'm from the West, so I'm very familiar with this area, but I realized that not a lot of Americans have been to the Southwest. They haven't been to New Mexico or Arizona. And I think increasingly now that for family vacations, people are not going on driving vacations as much anymore. Many people have not ever seen, sometimes even photographs of the places that I'm talking about. They will kind of know what the Grand Canyon looks like, but not anything. I always get sort of surprised responses when people read about the fact that at the Battle of Valverde in central New Mexico in February of 1862, that it snowed on them. It snowed on the soldiers. And they're like, but it's the desert. And I'm like, but it's the high desert. They're up at 4,000 feet. And in the high desert in that region, it snows in the winter time. Like that's just what happens. And there are high mountain passes and there are pine trees. These are different sorts of places. And so I really I knew that I wanted to put readers on the ground with individuals so that they could understand all of that complexity and hopefully, because, this is a pretty wide ranging history. It's first of all, starts in 61, but doesn't end until 68, which is a much longer chronological time frame than your usual Civil War history. And it's taking place kind of all over the Southwest in, Texas and Colorado and New Mexico and what became Arizona and California. And so I knew that in order not to overwhelm the reader, because I think you're right. I mean, if you read a textbook, that is like the deadliest of all historical writing, because it's just overwhelming. There's just like too much stuff. So I knew that I wanted to give readers people they could attach themselves to. And 9 people is a lot of people. But I was inspired by the example of Game of Thrones, because that show and that series of books has like hundreds of characters and has probably 20 or so main characters. And I was like, if people can follow Game of Thrones and become sort of obsessed with it, they can follow 9 people who are different enough and interesting enough in their own right to become invested in the course of a history book. But I think that's the way that because I think that people may not understand history as nuanced, but they understand people as nuanced.
And that's what makes, in a world where we are losing nuance and getting down to bullet points, what makes a historical event stand out in our mind is when we can tie that to a person's experience and we can latch onto a character, because that's what we remember characters. We remember characters' experiences. So I'm intrigued by the 9 characters that you chose as viewpoint characters for the story. I was really only familiar with one of them, Kit Carson, and then only by name. He's one of those characters that we've all heard and we vaguely know a story or two about, but it was really interesting to see him as a person, and all of these other people as well. So how did you choose the people?
So I knew Kit Carson had to be in it from the very beginning. First of all, it was important that readers had, like you had, the experience that you had, where there's at least one person they know. You know, you need to give them some kind of familiarity, something to latch onto where they're like, oh, okay, I understand sort of where we are and who we're with in this context. So I knew Kit Carson had to be there. Plus, he was a really pivotal figure. I mean, he was a colonel in the Union Army. He fought at Valverde, leading the first New Mexico Volunteers, which were made up almost entirely of Hispano soldiers. And then he also pivoted with another one of the protagonists in the book, James Henry Carleton, to lead Indian campaigns, starting in the fall of 1862, but really ramping up in the fall of 63 and the winter of 64. And the targets for that were the Mescalero and the Chiricahua Apaches, and then the Navajos. And so I knew that he needed to be a major figure because he bridges the kind of two parts of the book. He's one of several protagonists who do, and I call them. I've been calling them protagonists, by the way, Hank, because I don't know what else to call them. It sounds like then that they're fictional, but they're not fictional. Everything that you read about them in the book is true, has been, or as close to the truth as we can get to it.
We're all the protagonist of our own story.
Yes,
and I think people are smart enough to understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, good. So they're all real people, but they are protagonists, and so I knew that he needed to be in it. So he was one of the first people I knew was a kind of solid lock. Some of the other people I ran into just as I was doing research. I knew I needed John Baylor, who is readers will follow him in the first chapter of the book because he is the first mover. He leads a small contingent of Texas Mounted Rifles into New Mexico Territory and invades the Union in July of 1861 and establishes a foothold there for the Confederacy in southern New Mexico. And so, and the more that I read about him, the more I thought, oh, this is great, because John Baylor is an extremely complicated person. He is ambitious and violent and really terrible in many ways, but then also he writes love poetry to his wife and is constantly daydreaming about planting a garden with her and their house in Arizona in the future, and things like that. So I knew that he was a complex enough character to be really intriguing, a sort of anti-hero who people would kind of feel complicated about being drawn to at the beginning of the book. And then I knew I needed certain people to be able to kind of narrate all of the moving parts of the war in the West. So that's why Bill Davidson comes in as part of the Sibley Brigade. And he actually, he was in his early 20s. He was a lawyer. He, had signed up for the war and ended up participating in every single battle and every single movement of the Sibley Brigade in that first phase of the Confederacy's war the Confederacy's campaign for the West in New Mexico. And so that was of great utility to me because he could be there the entire time. Louisa Canby, I found pretty early on through both Confederate and Union sources because she plays a very pivotal role in the aftermath of the Battle of Glorieta Pass. She's a civilian. She's living in Santa Fe at this time. And through her eyes, we get to experience what it would be like to have a Confederate army, first of all, having the Union Army abandon the city and then have a Confederate army come in and take it. And then trying to deal with the influx of soldiers and then nursing injured soldiers after the battle. And so I knew I wanted to have women in there also, because often when you have military histories of the war that focus so intensely on these conflicts, women kind of fall out of the picture. But women were very much a part of the picture because in many ways, the war in the West was a kind of home front war. Everything was being fought near homesteads. They were they were capturing cities. They were, and then in the Indian campaign part of the Union's war effort, they were making hard war on Native communities, which involved forcing women and children to surrender to the Union Army in addition to men. So, that's just a couple of the people. And some of them I chose. John Clark, who's the surveyor-general of New Mexico Territory. I decided to write about him because I found 27 volumes of his diary
Wow.
in the Chavez Library in Santa Fe. And sometimes that happens, when you're a historian, sometimes you kind of stumble on these people. You maybe hear about them a little bit, but then you find their records, and their records are so amazing and so rich. And Clark was also there from beginning to end, from 61 to 68. He had a couple of furloughs. He went and visited DC a couple times and went home a couple times, but he always came back to New Mexico, and his Santa Fe diaries are unbelievably detailed. Like, I know what the weather was like on pretty much a daily basis. He talks about all of the social life in Santa Fe. He describes multiple times that he attended seances with Louisa Canby.
Wow.
To try to reach the spirits, and, goes kind of on like musing about why, like, what is the force that moves the table? I don't understand. Like, this is just amazing. And so he became a very vivid voice for me in the book. And also he was a representative of the Lincoln administration. And so he became a really good way for me to not only kind of give the reader very rich detail about what was going on in Santa Fe, but also connect it to these larger kind of political motives on the part of the Lincoln administration and the Republican Party, because he's the one enacting all of the Republican sort of visions of the West on the ground in New Mexico.
So much here to be uncovered. Megan, why is it so important that we not lose these people's individual stories? Setting the historical record straight is wonderful and is a noble, venture and cause. So those things are important, sure. But what is it about history that is so important to our present well-being, understanding of human nature? What is it about individual history that we should be so passionate about preserving?
Well, I think when you look at individual people's lives, you come to understand all of the things that we have in common, right? I've never really liked the cliche that, like, you need to know history so as not to repeat it.
Right.
But
that's what we always hear. But
yeah, we always hear that.
Trite now.
It's a little trite. What I like better, I think it was maybe Twain who said something like, "History doesn't repeat, but it does echo." And I really like that, because I think that's really true. And when you look at the records and you really kind of dig into someone's life, you find those echoes, like Louisa Canby and Juanita, who is another protagonist in the book, who is Navajo, and you read about the experiences of Navajo in the Union campaign to take away their homeland through her perspective. And through their experiences, you really you see what life was like for women during this period in history. You see how strong they were, about the roles that they played in their families and in their societies, and particularly Juanita, who was a very accomplished weaver. Her story allowed me to talk about how women in Navajo society really drove that part of their economy. They looked after the sheep. They got the wool, they spun it, and then they wove it into these blankets that became trade items, extremely expensive and very valuable in the Southwest. And so they were driving this whole economy of trade with this skill that they had in textiles. And I think that just enables us to think about, if we then start to think about women today and the kinds of things that women do that are often unrecognized, where they are contributing to the household economy, they're contributing to the local and national economy in ways that either we don't recognize or we deliberately ignore. And that, I think, just it helps to illuminate all of the meaning kind of in our own lives when we think about individuals in the past and what they were doing. I mean, they don't have access to the kind of technology that we have. They don't have, so many things are very different. But I think you do find those echoes. And it's important to listen to those and to recognize those, because I think we're always today looking for meaning, right? I mean, I think this is why we have our own communities and we engage in whatever kinds of activities we engage in. And this is why we read literature. This is why we want to have these experiences where we're trying to figure out the meaning of something. And for me, it was really important that I recover the experiences of these 9 people, not only to create this much fuller, more complete sort of sense of the Civil War as a continental conflict, a conflict that involved a lot of different communities that we don't usually think about. But I also wanted us to just have a closer connection to people living in the past and to understand that they were real people,
Right. The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native peoples in the fight for the West. This is a look at the Civil War like you have never seen before. Megan, we could talk all day about this. This book is so fascinating. And it absolutely reads like a novel.
Wonderful.
I'm recommending that everyone get a copy of this. There's going to be links to it in the show notes of this episode.
Fantastic.
If people are just learning about you is there a place online where they can connect with you?
Yes, there is. I have a website that is www.megankatelnelson.com. And on that website, there's a page that has links to podcasts like yours and to other interviews I've done that they can access online. And then more about the book. And also, hopefully, if we can actually see people in person again sometime in the future, it also has my schedule of speaking events. So I will be updating all of that and keeping people informed through that website.
Excellent. And before we started recording, we were talking about the trying times that we find ourselves in, and if you're listening out there and your local bookstore may be closed right now, where you can't go buy a physical copy of the Three-Cornered War. It's out in audiobook, which I just added to my Audible queue. Also in Kindle edition, you can get your hands on the book, and then when your bookstore opens back up, then go support your local bookstore and go get your physical copy for yourself, or to share with a friend or a loved one or something. But let's keep our local bookstores in mind if we can during this time, and then put it in your Audible queue, and this will be a fantastic audiobook, I promise. Megan Kate Nelson, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. This has been so much fun, and I can't wait to have you back.
Yeah, this has been great, Hank. Thank you so much.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed Answer Me over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this? You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right, Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. How do you know about that? He asked. You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen, the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. Come. Now. Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to its...
Some things you write now, do they differ in the writing process from
plants? Looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I? He asked the mysterious caller. You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire? The caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. If you're so close, why can't I see you? He asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.